a lot of things in my hands right now. Hold on. Alright. Sweet. It's going to be interesting because I've never talked about this before, but I'm excited about it, mostly because I think it's important, also because I'm kind of a 16-year-old girl when it comes to Google and the internet. I have like a Tumblr and I had a Twitter, but it got scary. I've had like 3 live journals and 2 Bandcamp pages and Facebook and another website, a Vimeo, last step. Anyway, there's too much stuff. But basically, the talk is going to be about, if this thing works, how the internet is reshaping our minds, relationships, and ideas about who we are, about ourselves. And this first part isn't really anything new. People have talked about it for a long time. You might be familiar with this guy, Nicholas Carr, who had a cover article in The Atlantic back in 2008 asking if Google's making us stupid, and specifically what the internet is doing to our brains. And he says in it, I'm going to have to read from up here because it's bigger, and if it comes up. Alright, over the past few years I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming my memory. My mind isn't going so far as I can tell, but it's changing. I'm not thinking the way I used to think. And so his basic idea is that the internet's changing stuff. The problem is he doesn't really know what it's changing or why or what's going on, and there's really no research in there. So I think a good way to figure out how the internet might be changing us is to kind of look at how people will use the internet. And so if I was to make my own guess, here we go again. Here we go. I would say we use it probably for 2 things, not equally. First is looking at pictures of kittens, because they're really cute. And then second, about 25% would probably be porn. Again, these aren't mutually exclusive. When you Google kitten porn, you get this. It's kind of weird. I had the safe search on, so it was pretty cool. Anyway, turns out it's more complicated than that. Who knew? This is actually from a Pew Internet research poll, and these are just things that people have used the internet for at least once in the past year. So people could be in multiple of these groups. They're not like mutually exclusive. But it's a bunch of stuff, and that's really confusing. And so I didn't want to talk about a lot of stuff. So I looked at it, and you can actually break it down into sort of 4 main categories. As you'll see here, there are 4. Basically, people like to buy stuff, waste their time, communicate with each other or stalk each other, and find information. And so the biggest chunk of this pie by far is finding information, even when you just take it as like strictly finding information, which is stuff like WebMD, Wikipedia, things like that. You can kind of categorize all of these as finding information if you want to. You know, you can find out what stupid stuff people are doing by looking at YouTube. You can find out what your high school girlfriend is doing by looking at Facebook and so on. But just strictly finding information, I think this is the part that actually has people most worried. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, is all the information that's available on the internet. And so this guy, Joshua Foer, who is the brother of Jonathan Safran Foer, who wrote Everything's Illuminated and Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close and Eating Animals, and that new book with weird like words cut out of it that I can't read, is also an author, and he wrote Moonwalking with Einstein, which is all about memory. And in it he writes that people once invested in their memories. They cultivated them, studiously furnished their minds, they were remembered. Today, of course, we've got books and computers and smartphones that hold our memories for us. We've outsourced our memories to external devices. We've forgotten how to remember. And so, obviously, he thinks this is a horrible thing. All of our memories should be inside of us, inside of our own heads, but now we're just storing them all over the place, and we don't really respect memory anymore. He's not the first person to have this idea, turns out. Plato, who you may have heard of, also had a similar idea. However, he never wrote it down. And there's a reason, which I'm kind of an amateur historian as well, and I've uncovered some very early footage of Plato, which I'll show you now, which kind of explains why he never wrote it down. Let's see if we can bring it up. Here we go.
This first character is called the pretentious illiterate. Here we go, pretentious illiterate. I told you, I don't know how to read.
So that's some of the earliest footage we have of Plato. Dude hated books. And he actually, well, he didn't write about how much he hated books because that'd be ridiculous, but people wrote about how much he hated books. And he reportedly said, writing will introduce forgetfulness into the soul of those who learn it. They will not practice using their memory because they'll put their trust in writing, which is external and depends on signs that belong to others, instead of trying to remember from the inside completely on their own. Which is, again, this idea that our memory should be inside of ourselves, not stored in books or on the internet or anywhere other than in our own heads. And finally, before I get to the actual sciencey, nerdy part of this, I want to talk about one other philosopher who I think actually nails the exact idea I want to talk about. And this guy's name, I always forget it. Oh, wait, the point is what I just said. We're outsourcing all of our memories, and in so doing, we're forgetting how to remember, which people see as a problem. But this guy has something else to say about it, which is right on the money. His name is Pete Holmes. Here we go.
So I have an iTelephone. I do. Which means I have Google on my phone. I'm guessing a lot of you do. I have Google on my phone now, and it's ruining our lives. I don't know if you've noticed, it's ruining life because we know everything. But we're not a lick smarter for it. We just know. You don't know something? Wait 2 seconds. You will know. Having Google on your phone is like having a drunk know-it-all in your pocket. There's no time for mystery or wonder. You're just like, how do they make glass? And you know. But the time between not knowing and knowing is so brief that knowing feels exactly like not knowing. So life is meaningless. I've literally been in bed in the morning, alone, just like, where's Tom Petty from? But I feel nothing, because there was no time to not know. Listen to me. There was a time, and I don't mean to get all Andy Rooney on you, but there was a time that if you didn't know where Tom Petty was from, you just didn't know. And you felt that yearning and that deficit in your being. And you'd go around and ask actual people, like, where's Tom Petty from? I don't know. And now I'm impregnated with wonder. And then they go and ask people. Until one fateful day, you see a girl wearing a Heartbreakers t-shirt, you rush up to her and you're like, hey, where's Tom Petty from? And she tells you, Florida. And a wave of endorphins and pleasure and meaning would wash over you. And you felt something. And that's how you met your wife. Do you understand? Your wedding song was Refugee. So you guys laugh. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night. Thank you.
Awesome. So probably my favorite philosopher. It's also worth mentioning that 80% of my research ideas come from stand-up comedy. So he said a lot of important things there. Most importantly, however, Aviv just told me that guy is the voice of the E-Trade baby, so that's cool. But he said two really important things, and I want to focus on one of them, and it was towards the end. He hits on this idea that we've always used external memory storage devices. These devices just used to be people. Before we had books and before we had the internet, we just asked people when we needed to know information. And so the difference that the internet is creating isn't that it's fundamentally changing the way that our memories work, it's just changing where we store these memories, not that we're storing them outside of ourselves in the first place. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. But to get to this idea, we kind of need to go back in time. So we're going to do some time travel. Again, if this clicker works, boom. All right. So here's where we are now. Hopefully you guys are all aware of this. We're going to go back to 1985, which is before I was born, because I'm 7. And there were some cool studies done, but first there were also some interesting things going on with the internet. This is actually the year the first network addresses, or ISPs, network addresses were registered. The first one ever was symbolics.com. I went there yesterday. The only reason they exist is to brag about being the first thing that ever existed. They don't even do anything. Also, if anybody's from MIT, they registered this year, mit.edu. I have no idea when other things happened, but those are two interesting ones. Also what happened though, is that this guy, the man, not the bear, wrote a pretty sweet paper called Transactive Memory, a Contemporary Analysis of the Group Mind. And he talked about this idea that we use people as external memory storage devices. And the idea is that when we know people, we don't need to know everything, we just need to know who knows that. And in so doing, we have that knowledge available to us, which is very similar to the way that we use the internet. So we don't only know what we know what everybody that we know knows. So he did a step to look at this, as an example, here's me when I was 6, this is my birthday party. But if I really wanted to know something about, for example, pinball, I would ask my mom, because she's really good at pinball. I'm bad at pinball. If you want to know something about dinosaurs, you could just ask me, or that dinosaur back there. Probably a better source, I don't know, they're not very good at English. And if you want to know about stealing the spotlight, you could ask my sister. She's a little jerk. But the idea is that there's all this information in the world. We can't possibly remember all of it, but we can know people that do retain that information. And so if somebody comes up to us and starts talking about pinball, I'm going to tune out and start playing with my dinosaurs. My mom's going to pay attention. If the day comes when I really need to know about pinball, I can just ask my mom about it. And in that way, I have access to that information that she holds without ever actually having to remember it myself. All I have to remember is the fact that she knows about it. So they did a study on this, and what they did is they brought in 59 heterosexual couples who've been dating for at least 3 months. The idea being that in order to form these relationships, you really have to have this long-lasting kind of give and take with people. So you learn what people know and don't know, what people care about and don't care about. And so you know what information to let pass by, and what information is kind of your responsibility. So they brought these people in, and they either let them kind of do their own thing, or they split them up and put them with opposite sex members of other pairs. So the woman might be paired with Richard Simmons or something, and the guy would have Jane Fonda. And so they're still pairs, but they're new pairs. And so these are what are called natural couples. So these couples have been together for a long time, or impromptu couples. The other thing they messed with here was expertise. So the idea is that once you have this long-standing transactive memory relationship with somebody, you know who's going to pick up on what information, and you kind of work together to remember things. And so, like with your powers combined, you have a greater memory than either of you could have separately. But with some of them, they tried to kind of mess with that system by assigning expertise to one couple versus another. So they would say, just for today, let's assume you're the expert on some variety of categories and your partner is the expert on these categories. We're going to give you a lot of items to remember, just remember what's in your category. And then they basically just tested how good they were at remembering these things. And so they gave them a bunch of items. For example, Luke and Laura got married on General Hospital. I had no idea. Yeast reproduced by budding, also didn't know. I would have been really bad at this memory test, I guess. But they had 40 of them. And then the dependent variable, just to see how people were doing, was how well they did on this memory test. So impromptu couples actually looks a little different. Didn't help whether or not they had assigned expertise. They were just about the same no matter what. What's interesting is that if you look at the natural couples, and this comparison here, when natural couples weren't assigned expertise, so they just got to remember whatever they thought they were supposed to remember, they did better than impromptu couples, so these unnatural couples, in remembering things. But what's even more interesting to me is that when they were assigned expertise, they sucked really bad. And the idea here is that we form these kind of intuitive memory structures where some people are responsible for certain types of information and others are responsible for other types. And when you try to mess with that structure, the consequences are just disastrous. And this also works for individual memory. Another thing that's really super cool to me is when you look at among natural couples, the kinds of memories that they retained. So overlapping versus non-overlapping memories, basically meaning, did you remember the same thing that your partner remembered, or did you remember something completely distinct? To a certain extent, they did remember the same type of information, but by and large, they remembered completely unique types of information. So we give you all these like kind of trivial items, and people just naturally, without even being assigned responsibility, remember different things. And this only happens in these natural couples. It doesn't happen in the impromptu ones. So what's happening is that we're forming these structures between people where we're responsible for different types of information, and we know this, whether it be by like just picking up on what people like or what they're expert at, or whatever. And that frees up cognitive resources because we can let information pass us by if it's not important to us and we know that our partner is going to pick it up. So that's what happened when people existed. However, things have changed. But we'll get to that in a second. The bigger point here is, though, that not only are memory structures, they're also social structures. So they kind of bind us together. With the two of us, we can do things that either one of us separately couldn't do. So say my girlfriend is really good at knowing birthdays, I'm really good at knowing what people want, and then one day we get separated. I could be walking around for years with just like a bottle of champagne, and she could be at somebody's birthday with like chutes and ladders, and it doesn't work out for either one of us. We needed the two of us together to work out. And so together it kind of binds us together. It's this social glue. And I think actually the kind of greatest example of this is that the two people who did the original studies ended up getting married. So on the left, that's the guy that was being attacked by a bear. He made it. And on the right is his now wife. That's their daughters in the middle. And so they're still together. And so this is true. That's proof. So let's fast forward. We get to 91. This is when AOL was invented, which allowed you to go in chat rooms and like flame the NSYNC chat room by saying Backstreet Boys were better, and then go to the Backstreet Boys one and say the NSYNC was better, which is what I did in middle school because I sucked. It also enabled the greatest Tom Cruise, Meg Ryan romantic comedy of all time. If you prefer Sleepless in Seattle, you should leave because it's not as good. It's just true. If we go forward to 1998, this is when Google was founded. And then forward again to 2001, Wikipedia was founded, which is kind of the greatest compendium of knowledge on the internet. And just, I want to take this little segment from 2001 to 2012 and show something I think is pretty cool. So if you look at the increase in number of articles on Wikipedia over this time period, you see it's going up very steeply, right? And then kind of by matter of course, if you look at the number of new articles or percent growth per month, it's going down. Also makes sense. But taken together, it kind of creates this picture where we're being saturated with information. So the internet, despite all the information that's being created every day, is sort of full to a certain extent, or more full than it used to be. So almost anything you could ever want to find is available on the internet. And so the question really is this changing the way we're remembering things? So before the internet, we had to have a friend who was an expert at pinball, one who was an expert at stealing the spotlight. My dad's really good at changing the oil in cars and building tree houses, things like that. And so we had friends that knew all these independent things, and that tied us together as a community. Now the internet just knows everything, and we can Google it and know it instantly. And so is this changing kind of the structure of our social relationships? And so one way of looking at that is looking at the way we remember things. So we're fast forwarding again to 2001. This is a paper that was published last year. And what people did is they gave them a computer and they had them type in like trivial questions. And the main question is, will we remember things if we think somebody else is responsible for it? Which is very similar to this transactive memory idea. And so they type these questions in and then either believe that they're going to be erased by the computer or saved later. And so when they thought that they were going to be saved, they didn't remember anything because they didn't need to. Somebody else was remembering it. They were responsible for that information. When they thought it was going to be erased, they did remember it. What's more interesting to me, though, is that even if you were explicitly said, please remember these items, you're going to be tested on them later, no matter what, it didn't make a difference. And this is similar to the idea that you can't really mess with these transactive memory structures. Once they're in place, they're in place. And if you give people explicit instructions to like change what's going on, you're not going to change these structures because they're long time, they're long lasting. And to me, the idea of information being erased and irretrievable is a little bit ridiculous, especially in this day and age, because everything is saved on the internet. So that's almost the most synthetic of the conditions. And you could extrapolate from this that information that's coming in 1 year, we never really need to remember it because we can always look it up later. And even if we tell ourselves, I better remember this, that's not going to change it because we can always look it up later. So it seems like we're kind of letting information sort of pass through us because we know that it's always available. The other question we can ask is, oh yeah, there's an answer by the way. It's changing the way we're remembering things. But the other question we can ask is if it's actually changing our social relationships. So before, if I needed to know about pinball, I'd ask my mom. Who am I going to ask now? And so what people did to study this is they gave people trivia questions. Again, this is who would ask for these various questions. And the questions is, if we're just going to ask the computer now. And so they gave people all these trivia questions, and they were either easy or hard. So easier trivia questions, you just know the answer. Hard ones, you don't know the answer. These are usually the situations where you go and you would ask a friend or somebody who might know the answer. And the way they tested what people were thinking about was by using a modified Stroop task. Who here's familiar with the Stroop task? Anyone? Okay, sweet. So it's basically when you see a color and a name, you're supposed to name the color. So for example, I mean, this is easy, right? So you would say red, because they're both red. However, it's a little more difficult if I tell you to name the color, and it's green, because you're kind of confused, because you're reading green, but also you know you're supposed to say red, so the information's kind of impeding each other and you're slower. Turns out it also works for other things. It's really just any kind of concept that's more primed in your mind is going to make you slower to name that color. So if you're really thinking about Google, and I tell you to name the color of a word, and I give you Google in the color red, it's going to take you longer to say red because Google is primed in your mind. So slow response times to things like this indicate that that concept is more primed in your mind, like you're more thinking in terms of Google. So what people did is they gave them easier or hard response or trivia questions, and then they gave them a Stroop task where they had words that were either related to the internet or general brand names like Nike, or just general words overall. And what they found is that when you're asked really hard questions, it takes you a long time to name the color of the word if the word in question is related to the internet, which again suggests that we're kind of primed this idea of the internet. So the first thing we think of when we're asked these really hard questions is Google, Yahoo, the internet, things like that, places where we can find the answers, not people we can ask to find the answers or ways we can figure out the answers, but basically just searching for our phones or searching on the internet and finding the answer that way. So taken together, we let a lot of information kind of pass through one ear and out the other, and then when people ask us questions about this information we no longer remember, our first instinct is to go to Google. So that's weird. Basically, when we're faced with difficult questions, we automatically think of the internet. And so, is the internet changing the structure of our social connections? I think it's still kind of a maybe. Something that does speak to it a little bit, though, is that kind of the flip side of transactive memory. So in divorce, a lot of times people will talk about the worst thing is kind of feeling like you don't know anything anymore, because half of your memory structure is gone. So again, with the birthday thing, I don't remember if I knew where it was or what to buy people. But either way, I'd either be like wandering around, neighborhoods with champagne for forever, or just showing up at the door with a horrible gift. Only together do we know these things. And so when that person is gone, you don't remember anything. There was actually a study recently where they had people go without the internet for 24 hours, just a day. And 40% of people said they just felt the loneliest they'd ever felt in their entire lives. Like they're just missing parts of themselves. And I think that kind of speaks to this, at least by reason of analogy, that these are doing similar things. One last thing. So basically the internet remembers everything. We don't need to remember anything. The question is, do we know about this? Do we know this is happening? And let's see if we can click this guy. There we go. And so this is the last part of it, how the internet is reshaping kind of our ideas about ourselves. And there's sort of three possibilities here. There's one, we know that we're relying on the internet for everything, and so we think we're really dumb. There's two, we know it or don't know, but we don't care. Or three, we don't really know it, and we think we're really smart because we know all this stuff now because it's all in our pockets, and so we think it's ours. And that's what I kind of wanted to test in this one. This is part of some work I started doing a few months ago. So this is more Google effects on self-esteem, and not self-esteem more generally, but cognitive self-esteem, so our ability to think about and remember information. So what we did was, let me tell you about Amber Case. Have you guys heard of Amber Case? She's a cyborg anthropologist, which is a real thing, apparently. And she's really good at it turns out. But she talks about tool use, and for thousands of years, tool use was sort of a physical modification of the self. But what we're looking at now is tools as a modification or an extension of the mental self. So we're kind of expanding ourselves mentally, and the internet might be this sort of mental expansion of the self, which is similar to something that was said by one of Google's co-founders when he said that we want Google to be the third half of your brain, which is pretty profound, also not very good math. So, this is what I had to suck. whatever. Google has found it really close to here. They might be here. I'm scared. The question is whether or not we think of Google as the third half of our brain, basically. So we gave people trivia questions, and they either use Google to answer the questions or not. And then afterwards, we just had them fill out this cognitive self-esteem questionnaire where they basically said how good they are at thinking, how good they are at remembering things, and we looked at their scores. And what you find is that after people use Google, they think they're a lot smarter and better at remembering things than after not using Google, although it's really clear they just used Google to answer all of these questions, which I think is ridiculous. You can also break it down. We have thinking and memory subscales, so you look at the thinking subscale, they think they're better just thinking about stuff in general. And then the memory one is most interesting to me because they also think they're a lot better at remembering things, specifically because some of the questions are like, I'm really good at remembering trivial information, and you know that you just used Google to look up this trivia. And I think what some of this could be coming down to, and we're testing this now, is something that was also alluded to in the clip I showed earlier, where the difference between knowing and not knowing is so short, they feel exactly the same. And so if I ask you a question, you usually have this kind of vague sense of, well, maybe I know, and it's actually faster to search Google than our own memories. And so by the time you find the answer, you're like, oh yeah, totally, that's what I was thinking. And so you have this hindsight bias where you think you knew it all along, although Google actually knows all the information, or the internet knows the information, Google's your portal to it. And we're kind of trying to parse that apart now. But it seems like what's happening is we have this general sense of knowing, and then we get the answer and we're like, that was what I thought it was. And so then we attribute it to ourselves. And we actually have some other interesting stuff where the more people use Google, the more they kind of incorporate it into the sense of self, sort of like a third brain. So we are like part Google machines, cyborgs, but not really. So there we go. So even though we're responsible for knowing, or what is that a sentence? Yeah, it is. Okay, cool. Beer. Even though we're responsible for knowing less, we feel like we know more, and I think that's the irony of it, is that we're outsourcing information, or the responsibility for information to the internet, even more so than we did to people, because the internet knows pretty much everything. It's super fast, and it's always there, and people don't know everything, and they can be wrong, and they're not there all the time when you need them. But we feel like we know more. So this is irony where we're responsible for knowing less, however, the whole time we just feel super smart and like we know everything in the world. As Google becoming the third half of our brains, maybe you guys can talk about it if you want. But sort of as a takeaway, this is kind of about the way the internet's reshaping our minds, relationships, and ideas about the self, which are all interconnected. With the idea being that it's changing the way that we outsource memory and what we outsource memory to, which is changing our social connections, and it's also changing the way we feel about who we are. And there's a very distinct difference between asking a friend for information versus asking the internet for information, according to a lot of dimensions. And I think this is kind of this revolutionary thing that's changing our minds in ways that maybe nothing has before. So I'm kind of excited about getting into it. Hope you guys didn't think it was too lame. If you did, at least there was that Galifianakis earlier, so that's cool. I mean, Plato, whatever. So anyway, thanks for listening, and that's it. So, yeah. Right, so the question is whether the trivia questions were based on like expert tech knowledge, or is there like a question about whether it was sort of for each person a different trivia question? No, so there were standard trivia quizzes, but we did pre-test them to make sure a couple different things. Basically, they were all based on middle school knowledge, and we pre-tested all the questions to see how many people got them right, and then how fair they thought it was, and how sure they were of their answers. We basically used the ones that less than 50% of people got right, but they all thought that they were super fair, and were all kind of sure of their answers. So it's like general knowledge that people just don't remember anymore, but that's kind of, I mean, we're stacking the deck a little bit because we were trying to get these things where people feel like they kind of know the answer, and then Google's so fast that they just confirm what they actually didn't know, if that makes sense. So,
Are you testing for confirmation bias?
how so? If you want to know about confirmation bias, what do you mean?
So, like, people think that they know the right answer, and then they check
Yeah, so that's the idea, is that people think they know the right answer, and then they get it, and then they think it was their answer. And so it's the know-it-all long effect, or hindsight bias in general. Once you have that answer in mind, you think it was yours, even though you didn't have it. In order for that to happen, I think you do have to have this vague sense of knowing in general. But what we're doing to test for that is basically messing with the time period, that there's like a lag between when you can and can't use Google. So at some point, you have to come to terms with the fact that you have no idea what's going on. And so we're basically messing with that time lag and getting people to come to truth with their own ineptitude in ways. And so after that point, you shouldn't have them kind of treating Google's intelligence as their own, if that makes sense. Sweet. Up here. Right. So the question is basically if we retain information for different lengths of time, depending on where we get it from. If we get it from Google or a book or friends, whatever happens. We haven't really looked at that. I think that the 2011 study speaks to that a little bit. So if we're typing things in and we think that Google's going to remember it, then we just don't bother to remember it. You could imagine that for a book, but I think you'd actually retain it a little bit better. And this is completely conjecture. You'd remember it better because it's more of a hassle to look at a book again. And the thing that separates people and books and Google is basically the ease and speed with which you can get that information. So if the answer is always in your pocket and it's super fast, then why bother retaining it? If you have to go look through Encyclopedia Britannica, that's a hassle. You should remember everything you can about platypi, platypuses, whatever, you know. So, good question. Go this way. Phil?
Do you know if there were general effects on the mood from the conditions? Like if people didn't get that many of the answers right because they weren't looking at them up, maybe they were a little sad at the end because they didn't get some answers. Did you look at mood?
That's a good question. So yeah, we did a mood measure of the PANAS, if you guys are familiar with that, which is the positive and negative affect scale. There weren't differences overall, although when we told people they couldn't use Google, even before doing the trivia question, they were just pissed at us because they really like Google. So that we did find that difference, but that wasn't driving any like effects on self-esteem or anything like that. We also tested for other types of self-esteem, so general self-esteem, how you feel about yourself as a person, no differences there. And then weird things like physical self-esteem, like people don't think they're better athletes after they use Google. It's very specific to knowledge and things like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So the question is if there's been any research into how well people use Google. And it's funny because I never thought about this until I was hanging out with my mom over Christmas break. She sucks at it, just really bad. I just assumed everybody could use Google. And not to my knowledge, but I do think that there's, to the second half of my question, I don't think that us forgetting things because Google is there as a problem. I'm not a Luddite. I think that this is actually something we can scaffold on top of. Nobody now would say that books are horrible, but Plato would have, right? And so now we have all this information here. The question is, what's the new intelligence? And I think it very well could be being able to find this information and combine it in new and meaningful ways. And so what we're doing, similarly to transactive memory with people, we're freeing up these cognitive resources because we can't remember everything. So it's good when our friends do it. It's even better when Google remembers every possible thing, right? And so now we can combine these in new ways, and we don't have to basically use as many mental resources to hold on to all this information because it's all there. You just have to know how to find it and how to put it together. So yeah, great question. One more question. One more. You're shaking your hand a lot. Sorry, you stood up too late. Okay.
I just wanted to know, did you do any sort of comparative analysis between access points? So there's people who would access Google via PC, I think would be considered for a population, and then people on the road that they could get younger demographic, maybe more tech savvy, and I think maybe it's quite common, but could you go into that?
Right, we'd love to do that. So the question is if we looked at differences between access points, so accessing Google over the PC versus over the phone. We actually did all these over the internet, so they're all on PC. I'm really interested in smartphones because it is a very clear analog to sort of prosthetic in a way. That it's this tool that's always with you and people think of themselves. Also, when you guys are walking around, pay attention to pronouns people use when they're checking their phones is super cool. When you ask people a question, they're never like, oh man, let me find out. They're always like, I'll check. which implies, right, that they know the answer, they just want to check real quick. And so that's kind of another one of the reasons that I thought this was cool. But no, we haven't looked at that. We did look at which search engines people were using and things like that. So that kind of gets at older demographics, like people who are still using Alta Vista, I'm assuming just are 90 or something. But there weren't enough to like look at real differences. But that's a great question. I'd like to get into that. And I have no more time for questions. Sorry, Jeremy.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm sorry to cut off questions, but feel free to accost him in between the talks. I hope it's okay that I said that. Please go ask questions. He'll be around.